Hi, today we're going to talk about Dr. Iain McGilchrist. He is a psychiatrist and literary scholar, and he specializes in the brain and why it is we are the way we are. He's actually giving a speech here. We're going to take a look at a video. It's Unheard as a channel. They look at fringe topics and things which go against the mainstream narrative in one way or another. And what Dr. Iain McGilchrist is basically talking about here is why is it that we are so absurd and incapable of thinking straight and acting so weird, and why is the world so polarized in the way it is? So I think it's well worth your while checking this video out, hanging in there for a few minutes and getting an idea of how it is that your brain works, how it's wired, and why it is that we human beings find it so difficult to get along. Okay, let's jump ahead a bit.
Which would take us somewhere that we may or may not know, which is the important part that resistance, negation plays in creation. Anyway, there we are. So that's the first problem. And then I started to look at the literature, and I was fortunate enough to come across a colleague who'd been working in that area for 20 years, John Cutting. And effectively what he had found is that there were significant differences, but they didn't follow the map, reason and language, emotion and pictures, for example.
Okay, so what he's talking about here is how the brain is split in two. The actual lecture is an hour and 30 minutes. So I'm skipping in bits and pieces. We all know they have the left and right brain, and traditionally we think of the right brain as creative, and that's the part that's right brain is your left hand. So artistic people are usually left-handed, and that's the right brain. And then the left brain is the analytical brain, which is usually right-handed. But as he's going to note here, it's not quite as simple as that. It's a bit more complex than that.
Because it's quite true that both are involved in both. But they're each of them involved in all those things, in everything that they do, in a different way. So it was not about the what, but about the how.
So, because what we actually had was originally the idea was that right brain creative, left brain analytical. Recent research says, no, it's all a bit more confused. And so people have some people at least have given up on the right brain, left brain thing. And what he's basically saying here is, they all do the same thing, but which one is dominating, which one is taking over? And this is really where we're getting into the hierarchy of the brain.
You see what I mean? And that actually turns out to be very, very important. So they each contribute to reason and language and emotion and so on. And the left hemisphere is not, unbiased and unemotional. It's actually prone to anger and aggression.
Important point here, the analytical side, the organized side is prone to anger and aggression.
It's very far from being calm. It also tends to jump to conclusions more than the right hemisphere, which Ramachandran, a great neuroscientist, has called the devil's advocate.
So basically, if you think of it as people are perceivers and judgers, and the judgmental side of your brain, the part which is the inner critic, the part which criticizes other people, is actually that left brain. And the right brain is more kind of observant and peaceful. You also see this, you see the breakdown of the face. If you look at the right side of the face and the left side of the face, you'll actually see there is actually a difference. So the left eye linking to the right brain tends to have a more passive look, and the right side of the face is linked to the left brain has a more active look. So you have an active side and a passive side, a doer and a perceiver. Think of it that way.
Anyway, what my research is over 30 years and my collaboration with John Cutting in the initial phases of that reveal is that these two manners of being in the world that these hemispheres bring for us are to do with the way in which we attend. Now that may not sound very exciting. In fact, when I first realized that the basic thing here was attention, the penny didn't immediately drop. It was all attention. It could be memory. It could be, calculation. It could be anything. What's special about attention? Well, the answer is that attention is actually how our world comes into being. We can only know the world we experience, and how we experience that world depends fundamentally on the type of attention. So if you attend to something in one way, you see one thing. If you see it attend in another, you see something quite different. And I sometimes talk about a mountain behind my house. I live at a place called Talisker on Skye, which is not actually where the whiskey is made. It's nearby. They try to keep it out of my reach. It's 4 miles away. But it's called that because it's from a Norse word Talisker, which means the sloping rock. Now, what that tells you is this mountain, which is a very extraordinary mountain, it has this sloping silhouette from the sea. So what one knows is to the Vikings 1,000 years ago, what that mountain meant was safety or danger, because it alerted them to the fact that they were in a very treacherous piece of water there, and the bay was full of rocks. But we also know there were Picts living there 1,000 years earlier than that, and they have their brocks, the ruins of their brocks are still there, and to them this mountain offered both shelter and was the home of the gods. Then in the 18th century, people started visiting Scotland to draw it and see the beauty and the sublime landscape. And so for them, this mountain was a many-coloured, many-textured form of great beauty. And in the 19th century, people got much more interested in geology for the first time. And it happens to be an extraordinarily good example of columnar basalt formation, the same as it is, in fact, in line with the Giant's Causeway in Ireland. And so it's part of the same formation. To somebody who wanted to mine basalt, this mountain means money, dollars. To a physicist, what it is 99.99% nothing. And in the other 0.01%, we don't really know what's going on. Now, which of these is the real mountain?
So this is a moot point and a philosophical one, kind of like Zen Buddhism. What is the sound of one hand clapping? It's that kind of a thing. Let's think of it this way. Imagine you go to you come on an airport bus, you're coming from the plane, heading into the airport, everybody's looking out the airport bus. Imagine there's 3 people at the back seat of the airport bus. One person is a womanizer, one person is a business person, and one person is an artist. And let's say they go into this big city. What are they all seeing? In that bus, what are they seeing? They're seeing different things. One man is seeing maybe some sexy ladies moving around. One man is seeing how much money is being generated per minute via the airport. And the other person is seeing, oh, how I could paint like this and draw like this. So attention is everything. We do have intention, a bit different about how we intend or we manifest. But this is attention. What am I looking at? And why am I looking? I'm basically seeing what I want to see.
Which of those is the real mountain? They're all real mountains. They just depend on the way in which and the goals with which we approach it. Everybody sees what they are interested in finding, and the way they attend makes all the difference. So basically, attention helps shape the world. And these 2 kinds of attention came about for an evolutionarily important reason. I should say that it's not just the human brain that is asymmetrical. All the brains of all the creatures we've looked at, birds, reptiles, amphibians, insects, they all have ganglia or prototype brains that are distinct, left and right, and asymmetrical. And even the oldest extant organism, Nematostella vectensis, 700 million years old, off the Isle of Wight, where it blends in very well with the average age of the community. It has an asymmetrical neural network, and it's been described as the origin of the mammalian brain. So there's something there that seems to involve all living things that requires this asymmetry. What was it? It's that every creature has to solve this conundrum. How can I eat and yet stay alive? Now, that doesn't sound difficult to you, but if you think back, for most of history, a creature has to be able to target something and follow it with its eyes and get it very accurately. And to do that, it has a very narrow attention. But if that's the only attention it's paying, it won't last very long, because it won't see the predator overhead. It won't see its mate and its offspring that also need feeding. So there needs to be two kinds of attention, and so different are these kinds of attention that they can only come about by having two centers of awareness. And the left hemisphere has this very narrow beam, perhaps 3 degrees out of the 360, targeted on the details. You can see very precisely. It fixes it and it grabs it. And the left hemisphere controls the right hand with which most of us do the grabbing and the getting. Whereas the right hemisphere has this broad, open, sustained, vigilant attention, which is on the lookout for everything else without preconception. So on the one hand, you've got an attention that produces a world of tiny fragments that don't seem connected to one another, a bit here, a bit there, and a bit elsewhere, that are decontextualized, that are disembodied, abstract, become examples of a category of things, and are fixed by the stare of the left hemisphere. So you've got these static, fixed, known, familiar bits and pieces. Oh, it's one of those, that's what I eat. Oh, it's one of those, and so on. Whereas, with the right hemisphere, we see that nothing really is completely separated from everything else, or indeed from anything else, ultimately. That all is, at some level, seamlessly interconnected, that it's flowing and changing rather than fixed and static, that everything is what it is because of the context it finds itself in, that embodiment is essential to the nature of what we're looking at, both our looking and the thing we're looking at, that there are unique individuals, that it's not just person, but it's Sue or Fred or whatever it is. And those distinctions, the uniqueness, is something the right hemisphere sees. But the left hemisphere sees just an example of something it uses and needs.
Okay, so basically right hemisphere is basically the mystical side, the empathic side. And the left side is the organized side. And it kind of, he'll get onto this later in the lecture, but basically we're living in a left brain dominant world, a world that's very organized and doesn't have much time for imagination, doesn't have much time for accepting other people or tolerating. It's all about getting things and seeking things. I mean, if you watch advertisements on TV, for example, it's just all about money, money, money. Everybody wants your money. And that's the world we're basically living in at the moment. And it does switch back and forth, as we'll see later.
The left hemisphere's world is thus a lifeless, literally inanimate kind of a world, and the right hemisphere's one, an animate one. And you can, in fact, now temporarily disable one hemisphere at a time in an experimental subject completely painlessly. And when you do that, you find that the left hemisphere sees things that are animate as mechanisms. When you have the right hemisphere alone functioning, it sees things that you would normally think of as inanimate as alive. So the sun is alive, it's moving across the heavens, it's giving warmth. So these are very, very fundamentally different ways of looking at things. And
so this is happening at the same time. At the same time, we are seeing things as what can I get and as everything is at the same time. But different ones are dominating, and our consciousness, our awareness is aware of maybe one or the other. So when I'm emotional with a family member, I'm more on this side. When I'm more focused on achieving things, I'm more on that side. But the two are actually taking place at the same time, and they're evolutionary because they give us more options. The left brain gives us the goal orientation, the right brain gives us the big picture.
The last thing I'm going to say is that, and again, this may not strike you as so fundamental, but believe me, it is the right hemisphere sees things as they come into being for us. I use the term presence, they presence to us, which is a term philosophers use translating Heidegger's Anwesen. And what he was getting at was that things are not just given, static, there, but they come about for us as we look at them and pay attention to them, and we see more what they are. They become what they are for us. And that's not to say that it's all made up by our minds. It's not as simple as that, nor is it that there's just a world out there and it's completely passive. There is an interrelationship between our minds and the world that is all the time constructing it. The right hemisphere is aware of this and is part of it. The left hemisphere sees representations, which literally means present again. after it's no longer present. So,
Left brain thinks about things, representations. After the fact, what happened here, why did that happen? Making sense of things, it's all left brain.
the right hemisphere's world is the world in which we live. The left hemisphere's world is, if you like, a map, a schema, a diagram, a theory, something two-dimensional.
So what he's saying here is the right brain is the objective universe around us, which is very broad and a huge range. And the left brain is our world view, our paradigm, our story, our viewpoint on things, which is created by each individual and shows a different viewpoint of each individual.
And it's got none of the richness that's in the right hemisphere as well. There's nothing wrong with that, because actually a map is very useful, and a map doesn't get more useful by including more and more detail about the names of the people who live in the houses and the plants they grow in the garden. No, a map, to be useful, has to be selective, and that's how it is. So we've got this one world which is composed of things that are mechanical, useful, inanimate, reducible to their parts, abstracted, decontextualized, dead. And another world which is flowing, complex, living, changing, and has all the qualities that make life worth living for us.
Thank you. That's a wonderful explanation. Let me ask you now to do another 300 pages in 3 minutes.
Yes.
Which is these two modes of attending have with them accompanying kind of philosophies, accompanying ways of seeing the world.
Yes.
And your thesis seems to be that not just as individuals, but as a whole society, recently, and I'm keen to know how long that you think that's been true for, have become overly dependent on the left hemisphere, or giving the left hemisphere too much attention, too much power in.
So now we're getting back to the why is the world polarized question.
Shaping the world as we understand it, and have neglected this wiser hemisphere that, as the Master and His Emissary, the book I mentioned, hints at, should actually be in charge of using the left hemisphere. So tell us how this has happened, sort of as wide as a society. How can it be that we start using one more than the other?
Yes, I mean, the title The Master and His Emissary refers to the idea of a much wiser master who has a servant who thinks he knows everything, but because he doesn't really know very much, he thinks he's got it all. But the wiser master knows that he needs a lot of work to be done, administrative work by the emissary. So you're quite right, the right hemisphere, things work well. There's vast amounts of evidence for this. As long as the left hemisphere is carrying out work it's deputed to do by the right hemisphere, rather like we use a computer. The computer doesn't really understand the data we draw from the complexity of life.
So we're in a society where the tail is wagging the dog. That's what he's basically saying. The left brain, we as a person and we as a civilization should choose what to focus on. And we're in a society where we're just focusing on, and everything else is based around that society. And probably this kicked off mainly in recent years in the Industrial Revolution, whereby human beings started to live like machines. And of course, since around the year 2000, we have algorithms. You want to write a book, you want to produce video, you have to have certain keywords. The algorithm will only pick up on that which came before, can never come up with something new. You do something new and creative. That's why you go back to old movies, old TV shows, old music. Why were they so creative? Because people had to go, and some of it worked. And nowadays, we've got like the internet, and we need to compete against a lot of other people, and we need to keep the algorithm happy. So we're forced, even in our content, to try and be repetitive just to get views. And so this is forcing us down this left brain goal orientatedness that's over dominating.
It's not its job. Its job is to process it very fast and hand us back some data, which we then take back into the world and make sense of. But what seems to happen in civilizations, and in the second half of The Master and His Emissary, I trace our Western history from the Greeks rather, through the Romans to the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, Romanticism, the Industrial Revolution, modernism and postmodernism. And what I think I can show is that with a sudden outburst of flourishing in which the two work very well together, and in the second half of the Master and His Emissary, I trace our Western history from the Greeks rather, through the Romans to the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, Romanticism, the Industrial Revolution, modernism, and postmodernism. And what I think I can show is that in two previous cases, the Greek and the Roman civilization began with a sudden outburst of flourishing in which the two work very well together. And then over time, it got more and more towards the left hemisphere's point of view. And partly, I think this is because civilizations tend to overreach themselves. They tend to amass an empire, and then everything has to be administered. And there are rules and procedures, and everything is rolled out under a bureaucracy. And what this privilege is a simple, sequential, analytic way of understanding, rather than the more complex, holistic understanding that is required and is provided by the right hemisphere. So to come to where we are now, what I think happened was the Renaissance was this sudden flowering in which, and it's not about the humanities versus the sciences. Neither, by the way, is it true that the humanities are somehow right hemisphere and science is somehow left hemisphere. Good science, good reasoning involves the right hemisphere as much as the left.
Very good point. Say you want a PhD, for example, you have to come out with something original research, and that actually requires creativity.
But what happened was there was great steps forward in so many aspects of life, a great richness. And then towards the end of the 17th century, becoming much stronger in the 18th century, was a sense that science had solved all the problems, and we were beginning to understand how to control everything ourselves. Unfortunately, the kind of thinking that gets drawn into that is also rather simple-minded, and it therefore doesn't see what it is it doesn't see. And I think that's where we've got to, is that we've trusted a way of systematizing, rationalizing, and we believe that if we just had a little bit more power, which is the raison d'etre of the left hemisphere to grasp, to get, if only we could do a bit more manipulation, we would solve everything. But at the same time, we're making an unholy mess of the world in so many respects. We're destroying nature, we're destroying humanity, really. We're just certainly destroying this civilization as though we're sort of taking a sledgehammer to it. And so this is a very sad outcome for this know-it-all left hemisphere. One of the reasons I think it's become, well, there are several reasons why I think it's become more potent. One is that, of course, it's the one that makes you rich. It's the one with which you do the grabbing and getting, and that's easy and straightforward.
We're in a grabbing and getting world.
Another is that it's much easier to explain the left hemisphere's point of view. It's money for old rope to say, well, look, if we do this, it leads to that, leads to that. Whereas actually what the right hemisphere is seeing is a complex system, which is different from a complicated system. A jet engine is a complicated system, but it's not a complex system. A complex system is one which is inherently unpredictable. Not disorderly, but it's not determined.
And remember, creativity is basically unpredictable.
And it has recursive loops within it, so that things become enormously complex. You don't have this A leads to B leads to C. And another is that when you start to articulate what it is your civilization is about, rather than getting on with it, once you start openly analyzing it, then you lead more and more to this left hemisphere point of view. And A.N. Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, who I consider one of the all-time greatest philosophers, and certainly of the last 100 years, said, a civilization flourishes until it starts to analyze itself. And that's remarkable because Whitehead was a mathematician and a physicist, and he was the co-author with Bertrand Russell of Principia Mathematica. But he was able to see beyond, he was able to see limitations of science, limitations of reason, which is not to disrespect science or reason. I happen to believe our science is not scientific enough. Too dogmatic. I happen to believe our reason is not reasonable enough. Too dogmatic. And it's dogma that's always the problem. We need science, we need reason, but we also need to see that they can't answer all our questions. You know, love is very real. Anyone who's experienced it knows that it's one of the realest things that can happen to you. But according to science, for it to be real, you've got to be able to see it in the lab, measure it, manipulate it. You cannot do that. And then you start thinking about all the other amazing things that we experience, goodness and beauty and love, and all those sort of things come under this head. So there are proper limits to science, proper limits to reason. Music, wonderful, can change your life. But it's just notes. You know, what is a note? Absolutely nothing. Well, let's have another one then. Still nothing. Let's have 30,000. 30,000 nothings go to make up Bach's B minor Mass, which can be one of the most powerful things you can hear. How did that happen? By amalgamating so many nothings. It's because it's all in relation. It's all in relationships. And what I'm suggesting is that relationships are primary. They're even primary to the things that are related. The things that are related, and what we call the things we notice, only become what they are because of the relationships they stand in.
So you
Okay, so I think it's very interesting, the final idea of relations, that we've basically reduced ourselves down. And that's the key thing that what you think in the Dr. Iain McGilchrist talk. He's saying, why are we living in the deluded world? We're living in a deluded world because from his point of view, and it makes sense to me, if we've gone too far towards the left brain analytical side, look at the world we're in. It's just all about making money. All about trying to get your money, more efficiency, more effectiveness, and try to force people, pretty much since the Industrial Revolution, to become more machine-like. And of course, we have interesting things like transhumanism. Transhumanism will look at human life and say it's not so worthy, that a computer is faster than a human being. But can a computer be creative? Can it create something new? I saw recently some of these great AI pictures. They look great. But, you know, if AI takes over, say, art and all that stuff, it'll all be repetitive. The creative side is lacking. And this is resulting in things like judgmentalism, dogmatic world, whereby Group A is fighting Group B, and neither group can understand each other. So why are we living in a deluded world? We're living in a deluded world because of the cognitive dissonance of a brain that is too much on the left dominant side. What Iain McGilchrist is saying here in the speech is that both are processing things. Both the left brain and the right brain are processing things, but one will dominate at different times. This is evolutionary because it helps us survive. The small focus picture, the big picture. And where we're going now in this world that's heading towards this AI apocalypse direction, I'm not saying there's going to be an AI apocalypse, a singularity, but certainly there's a tendency to try and make things more regular, more organized. Each generation of human beings is more organized. Some of it's good. We have a higher standard of living, we have better sanitation, healthcare and all that. But are we losing the essence of who we are? Okay, are we becoming mechanical men and mechanical women? Is that what we're becoming? So I think it's an interesting thing, and just for you to realize and think about, check the video out. It's 1 hour and 13 minutes on Unheard YouTube channel. Dr. Iain McGilchrist, Why Are We Delusional? Are living in a deluded world. And so the thing is, Group A cannot understand Group B. They're seeing a different world, okay? And vice versa, okay? I did a video the other week with Dr. John DeMartini. I was talking about one of his speeches where he's talking about how our actual sensory mechanism of our brain and our nervous system will screen out and pick up on things according to our value system. So when you're looking at the world, things a very crazy place, have a think about these things, especially this idea what Dr. Iain McGilchrist is saying, is that the left brain will always give you a discordant world, because like a world of objects and things, and nothing has any integration, okay? Whereas the right brain gives you integration. Not that the right brain is better, but presently the world is more left brain dominant, and we need to go more towards a balance because both are required. The left brain gets things done, the right brain has the vision. We have to get the two together. So hopefully this video will give you some insight. It certainly gave me a good insight about why it is that we have so much cognitive dissonance in the world, why it is we're in a deluded world, why it is that nobody can think straight or see anybody else's opinion. And what he says, if you watch the whole video, is that we're going down a very dangerous funnel that will head towards the destruction of society unless we start moving away from reductionism in how we think about the world. Okay? Hope you like this video. Please like and subscribe if you do, and I'll talk to you next time.